A 12-year-old boy saw something that morning, something no child should ever see, and 38 years later, he still can't close his eyes without seeing it again. September 4th, 1981. Lakeland, Florida. The morning was still. The kind of quiet that sits heavy. No wind, no movement, just the distant sound of birds and a neighborhood waking up slow. Judy Butler walked 3 doors down to her sister's apartment. Same thing she did every Friday. Coffee. Conversation. 30 minutes of normal before the day started. She knocked on Linda's door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. That was strange. Linda was always up first. Always moving. Always ahead of the day. Judy turned to walk back and stopped cold. The window screen on Linda's bedroom was gone. Torn away. The window itself was wide open, just sitting there in the morning stillness like something had forced its way through. Judy walked closer. Looked inside. Inside, the scene was devastating. It was immediately clear that Linda had been the victim of a targeted, violent attack, and the evidence left behind suggested a level of cruelty that the quiet neighborhood of Lakeland had never seen before. The scream that tore out of Judy Butler that morning shattered the quiet like glass. Patrol cars came screaming down Brunel Parkway. Radio static cut through the air. Officers moved fast, yellow tape going up around the building. Inside, in the living room, 15-year-old Jeff Sllayton was asleep on a cot. An officer shook him awake. Clothes. Outside. Now. Jeff walked out the front door and saw his Aunt Judy standing in the parking lot, her face destroyed. She told him. His mother was gone. In the back bedroom, another officer woke 12-year-old Tim, still in his pajamas. The officer said nothing about Linda. Just, get up, go outside. Tim stepped into the hallway. His mother's door was closed. Then it swung open. An officer walked out. 1 second of open doorway. And in that 1 second, Tim saw the reality of what had happened. He saw the aftermath of the violence that had taken his mother's life, a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The kind of silence that follows something like that. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that rings in your ears and never fully stops. Decades later, Tim Sllayton didn't say, I saw it. He said, I still see it. Present tense. Every day. That image never left. That is what this crime stole from a child who hadn't even started high school. To understand what was truly lost that morning, you have to know who Linda Slaten was before she became a victim. She was a fighter. Long before that Friday came. Linda was 19 when she married Frank Sllayton. For the next 9 years, she lived inside a slow-burning nightmare. Frank was a violent alcoholic whose anger landed on whoever was closest. He hit her. He put a loaded gun to her head in their bathroom while their boys were in the house. One night, little Jeff, barely 6 years old, came running in and threw his small body between his mother and the danger. A 6-year-old trying to save his mother with his bare hands. In 1974, Linda finally walked out. She took her boys and left Frank Sllayton with almost nothing. No car. Tight money. She stitched her own clothes to cut costs, but she kept her sons fed, kept them in school, kept moving forward with the kind of grit that holds a family together when everything else is trying to pull it apart. She was young, warm, everybody liked her. The kind of person who made you feel something just by being in the room, and just weeks before the murder, it looked like the hard part might finally be easing up. Linda had moved to Lakeland, a fresh city, a fresh start. She was bringing her mother down to live with them, a little help, a little less weight. The shape of something better was forming. They had been in that apartment for 2 weeks. She never found out what came next. Police processed that crime scene on September 4th, 1981, and they did not leave empty-handed. Sergeant Edgar Pickett, the Lakeland Police Department's most respected fingerprint expert, hunted that bedroom inch by inch. The furniture, the floor, the walls. And on the windowsill, the exact point where the killer had pressed his hand to climb through, Pickett lifted a palm print. The autopsy at Lakeland General Hospital provided another piece of the puzzle. Biological evidence. It was carefully collected and preserved in a forensic kit, waiting for a technology that didn't even exist yet. Day 1. Palm print. DNA. And the killer stayed free for 38 years. Something went wrong inside this investigation, and it started almost immediately. The first name detectives checked was Frank Sllayton, Linda's ex-husband, a violent alcoholic with a history of abuse. On paper, he made sense as a suspect. But Frank had been in Alabama the night Linda was killed. Alibi confirmed. Case closed on him. Linda's boyfriend had a solid alibi. The neighbors from the card party checked out. One by one, the obvious names disappeared from the list, so police turned to Jeff. He had just learned his mother was dead. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He was a child drowning in grief. The reasoning was thin. Jeff and Linda had argued the day before. He had stormed out on his bicycle and ridden 11 miles to his grandparents' house in the dark. Normal teenage conflict. But police noted it, circled it, and kept coming back. They pulled him out of school. Multiple times. Same questions, different angles, the same suffocating pressure every time. They watched his face, his hands, his body language, searching for something that was never going to be there. Then one detective crossed a line Jeff never forgot. He looked at this grieving 15-year-old boy across the table and said, "You got big arms on you. You're strong enough to put your hands around your mother's neck and kill her." To a child who had just lost everything. After Jeff passed his first polygraph, they asked him to take another. He passed that too. Then they wanted hypnosis, willing to reach into a traumatized teenager's mind and pull at it, just to find something that fit their theory. Jeff's grandparents finally put a stop to it. They walked in and told police directly, "Leave this child alone. Go find who killed our daughter." 2 weeks later, Jeff was formally cleared. No one ever apologized for what they put him through. Now, here is where this investigation reveals something darker than bad luck or missed clues. Sergeant Pickett had that palm print from day one. He knew it was the killer's. And in the days that followed, he was handed prints to compare, but they weren't from everyone connected to Linda. They were from black men in the neighborhood, pulled in based on vague reports of suspicious activity, fingerprinted, and run through comparison. Pickett confirmed this himself years later. Meanwhile, a 20-year-old white man who coached Tim's football team, who had dropped Linda's 12-year-old son off at that exact apartment just hours before she was killed, received a phone call. One brief phone call. No face-to-face, no fingerprints taken, no palm comparison done. He said he dropped the boy off and left. Police accepted that and moved on. The palm print sitting in evidence had never been compared to the man most likely to have made it, because that man was never asked to come in. This was not a failure of technology. Palm print comparison existed. It was being used, just not on him. The case went cold, not because the evidence failed, but because of who investigators decided to look at and who they decided to trust. Years passed. Jeff and Tim built lives. But they kept going back to the Lakeland Police Department, walking in, asking for updates, reminding whoever was at the desk that their mother's case was still open. Over the years, more than 20 detectives cycled through this case. 20 different people. The monster had no face. But he had never gone anywhere. And the most unsettling part of all, he wasn't hiding in a distant city or living under a false name. He was right there. Closer to this family than anyone could have imagined. While police were chasing dead ends, while Jeff and Tim were learning to live inside a grief that never fully dried, Tim was getting into a car with his mother's killer. Every week. Joseph Clinton Mills, 20 years old at the time of the murder. Coach for the Lakeland Volunteers football program. The man who picked Tim up from practice at Winston Elementary and dropped him home. The man Tim had started to trust as one of the few stable things left in a world that had completely fallen apart. Mills knew exactly what he had done, and he kept showing up anyway. During those drives, Mills would ask Tim casually, almost gently, "Any news on the case? Police find anything new? Any leads?" Not out of concern, out of calculation. He was using a grieving 12-year-old as his private intelligence source, quietly tracking how close investigators were getting. Every time Tim said nothing new, Mills got to breathe easy for another week. The predator wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding behind a face Tim trusted completely. 1 month after the murder, Tim's football team took their season photo. Tim hung it in his bedroom. For years, that photo was a source of quiet comfort, a reminder of teammates who had kept showing up, of a routine that helped him survive the unsurvivable. His mother had always told him, "Keep moving forward, don't stop." And that photo represented exactly that. Joseph Mills was standing directly behind him in that photo, smiling. Tim kept that picture on his wall for 30 years. 30 years of that face in the room, never knowing, never suspecting, never once imagining that the man grinning behind his shoulder had murdered his mother and then used him to stay safe. 20 years after the murder, a detective named Brad Grice took a fresh look at the case. Grice already knew Jeff. They had crossed paths years earlier through a bowling league, two people from the same city whose lives had accidentally overlapped. When Jeff walked into that meeting, Grice looked at him not as a file number, but as someone he actually knew. He collected fresh DNA samples from the brothers to formally clear them again. He went back through every person of interest from 1981, collected samples, submitted them to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. He worked this case with the kind of personal investment that went beyond the job description. And before Jeff left that first meeting, Grice made a promise. "I won't retire until I solve your mother's case." Jeff held on to that sentence for years. Someone had promised. Someone was still fighting. In 2001, Grice caught what looked like a real break. A man named Jimmy Omer had been convicted of a savage attack on a 10-year-old girl, pulling her through her bedroom window, nearly killing her. The method was hauntingly familiar. And Omer had been living in the same apartment complex as Linda at the time of her murder. Same building, same time frame, same method. But Omer had died in prison in 1996. Grice tracked down his mother and collected her DNA for an indirect comparison. The results came back and flattened everything. No match. They were back to nothing. And by 2005, Grice had the FBI running the DNA profile continuously through every federal database available, year after year. Nothing but silence. Then, in 2015, Grice got sick. Retirement came. The promise he had made to Jeff broke quietly, without ceremony. Jeff had already started preparing himself for the worst. He began saying something out loud that he had always feared in private. "I'll probably take my last breath not knowing who murdered my mom." He was starting to make peace with never knowing. But in a different state, a woman was about to sit down at a computer with a DNA profile and a case file. She had one weekend. And 38 years of cold case were about to crack open. If this case is hitting different, drop a comment below and let us know. Like this video and subscribe so you never miss another case like this one. And if you want more cold cases where killers hid in plain sight for decades, the link is in the description. Now back to the case. In late 2018, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement reached out to Detective Tammy Hathcock with a question. Would the Lakeland Police Department be interested in submitting DNA from the Sllayton case to a company called Parabon Nanolabs? Parabon wasn't offering standard DNA matching. They were using genetic genealogy, a method that had exploded into law enforcement after the Golden State Killer arrest in April 2018. Since that single arrest, nearly 100 cold cases had cracked open using the same approach. Hathcock said yes. On December 4, 2018, the DNA from Linda Slaten's 1981 rape kit, preserved carefully for 37 years, was sent to Parabon. And a genealogist named CeCe Moore took the case. Here is how this works, in plain terms. Every year, millions of people upload their DNA to genealogy websites, trying to trace ancestors, find distant relatives, understand their roots. They're not criminals. They're curious people building family histories. But when their DNA sits in that public database, it becomes a map for investigators. CeCe Moore uploaded the unknown killer's DNA to GED Match and let the database search for partial matches. Not perfect matches, distant ones. Third cousins, fourth cousins. People who shared small but detectable genetic signatures because they came from the same bloodline somewhere generations back. Then she started building, branch by branch, birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, social media, tracing each line forward through time, eliminating the ones that didn't fit, narrowing toward the one person that all three networks pointed to. 3 separate genetic networks, 3 clusters of distant relatives. And when she traced all 3 back far enough, they converged on the same family, the same bloodline, one man, the only son. She did it in one weekend. On June 5, 2019, Parabon's report arrived at the Lakeland Police Department. The conclusion was precise. Joseph should be strongly considered due to the fact that genetic connections were found to both sides of his family tree, and he was living in close proximity to the scene of the crime in 1981. Joseph Clinton Mills, age 58, Kathleen, Florida. 30 minutes from the apartment. Detective Hathcock went back into the original case files. She started going through names, witnesses, people interviewed, background checks from 1981, and there it was. Joseph Mills, interviewed by phone. One day after the murder, September 5, 1981. Hathcock grabbed that page and ran down the hallway to her sergeant. He was interviewed. The same name that genetic genealogy had just pulled from 38 years of silence had been sitting in that case file since the day after the murder. He had answered a phone call and walked free. For nearly 4 decades. But Hathcock and her partner, Detective Russell Hurley, weren't ready to move. Genealogy pointed to him. That wasn't enough for a courtroom. So they went back to 1984. The year Mills had been convicted of grand theft for forging a will. He never went to jail, but he had been fingerprinted, and a palm print had been taken. They pulled those records. Then they pulled Sergeant Pickett's original print, the one lifted from Linda Slaten's bedroom windowsill on September 4, 1981. The print that had sat in evidence for 38 years. August 2019. The comparison came back. Match. The same hand. 2 different decades. One result. They had his name. They had his print. Now they needed one more thing. Fresh DNA, directly from Joseph Mills himself. And they couldn't ask him for it. 2 detectives in dress clothes, digging through garbage bags. This is what justice looks like sometimes. They had tried surveillance first. Weeks of following Mills through his daily routine, watching where he went, what he touched, what he left behind. Looking for a discarded cup, a cigarette, anything with his DNA they could legally collect without approaching him. Weeks passed, nothing usable, so they made a decision. Under Florida law, once garbage hits the curb, it's abandoned property, no warrant needed. Hathcock and Hurley pulled up to Mills's address on Bailey Road in Kathleen, loaded his trash bags, and drove them back to the department. Then they put on gloves and started digging. Bag after bag, rotting garbage, no dramatic confrontation, no high-speed chase. Just 2 detectives going through someone's trash in a police parking lot, looking for a biological trace. And then they found it. A piece of used medical adhesive tape. The kind used to hold bandages in place. Unremarkable. The kind of thing anyone throws away without a second thought. They bagged it and sent it to the FDLE crime lab. Then they waited 11 days. While the lab worked, Joseph Mills went on living his life in Kathleen, 30 minutes from the apartment where he had murdered Linda Slaten. He was 58 years old, married to the same woman for decades. Father, grandfather. He had run a cleaning services business. He had driven trucks. He had watched his grandchildren grow up. 38 years of ordinary life, built on top of what he had done in that bedroom on Brunel Parkway. He went to sleep at night and woke up in the morning. And every single day, he had decided he was safe, that nobody was ever going to find him. 11 days. The lab results came back. The DNA on the medical adhesive tape matched the DNA from Linda Slaten's 1981 rape kit. 38 years. One result. Joseph Clinton Mills had murdered Linda Slaten. Now detectives had to tell her sons. When they heard the name, both brothers went quiet. Coach Joe. Not a stranger. The man who had given Tim rides to practice. The man Tim had looked up to when everything else was falling apart. The man who had sat across from a grieving 12-year-old in a car and asked, "Any new leads?" Tim thought about the photo immediately. The team picture that had hung in his bedroom for 30 years. The one his mother would have wanted him to keep because it stood for moving forward. Joseph Mills was standing directly behind him in that photo, smiling, in a picture taken 1 month after the murder. "I've been carrying the killer's picture in my house this whole time," Tim said, "and never had a clue." December 12, 2019. Detectives moved in and arrested Joseph Clinton Mills at his home. He didn't ask why. He didn't demand a lawyer. He showed no confusion, no shock. He was calm, collected, almost as if he had always known this day was coming and had simply decided to meet it without flinching. In the interrogation room, he denied everything at first. Never been inside the apartment. Never had sex with Linda. Dropped the boy off and left. The same story from the 1981 phone call, the one that had worked for 38 years. Then detectives put the evidence on the table. Palm print, DNA, genealogy report, his name in the original case file. Mills shifted. Suddenly, his story changed. He claimed he had been invited in, and that the tragedy was simply a situation that had escalated unintentionally. He tried to paint a picture of a mutual encounter gone wrong, but the physical evidence told a much darker story. Detectives didn't blink. The coat hanger had been pulled so deeply into Linda's skin that the physical evidence alone destroyed his story. The bruising, the force, the hanger taken from her own closet, where investigators believed Mills had been hiding, waiting in the dark for her to come home. Detective Hurley said it plainly. "I think it's pretty evident that he targeted her." He was in handcuffs now. The monster finally had a face. But Jeff and Tim still had something left to do, look him in the eye. February 9th, 2022. A courtroom in Lakeland, Florida. 41 years of grief, rage, and unanswered questions walked through that door. Jeff and Tim Sllayton, boys who became men inside the wreckage of that September morning, were finally in the same room as the person who had taken everything from them. Mills was 61 now. Gray. Quiet. He had spent 2 years maintaining a not guilty plea, saying nothing, waiting. Then, facing the possibility of a death sentence, he changed the plea to guilty. Not because he was sorry, because he wanted to live. The family was given the chance to speak. Jeff stood up first. He had been 15 the morning his mother didn't answer the door. He had spent his entire adult life not knowing who did it, raising his own children while carrying the hollow space where his mother should have been. He had named his son Brad after the detective who had promised to find the answer, because that promise had meant something when almost nothing else did. Now he was standing 10 feet from the man responsible for all of it. He looked directly at Joseph Mills and said what 41 years had built inside him. I hate you. You can't die and burn in hell fast enough for me. Why, Joe? Why'd you take my mama from me? I loved my mama. We were happy. Why did you have to murder my mama? Mills sat still, said nothing. Tim stood next. Where Jeff's pain came out as fire, Tim's came out as something colder and more precise. I saw the crime scene. I saw what you did. And then you acted like my friend. I rode in the car with you. Then Aunt Judy Butler, the woman who had knocked on Linda's door that Friday morning looking for coffee and found her sister dead instead, stood up. Joe, how could you do that? Do you have any soul? Do you have any remorse? The room waited. Mills said nothing to any of them. Linda's grandchildren also spoke that day. Children who had grown up hearing stories about a grandmother they never got to meet, who had seen the grief in their father's eyes every anniversary, who had never held her hand, never heard her voice, never sat at a table with her. The murder hadn't just taken Linda, it had cut off every version of her that was supposed to come after. Decades of Christmases, school plays, weddings, all of it gone before it ever existed. When Joseph Mills finally addressed the court, he did not apologize. He did not look at Jeff or Tim or Judy or the grandchildren who had just told him what his actions had cost them across generations. He said, I am a good person. I'm not that person. They're painting me out to be. I owned a successful business. I gave people chances. CeCe Moore, who had worked hundreds of cold cases, said later that the Sllayton case made her angrier than almost any other. Not just because of the crime, but because even in that courtroom 41 years later, Mills was still protecting his own image while the sons of the woman he murdered sat 10 feet away. He had never stopped being the man who asked him for case updates in the car, always calculating, always managing, right up to the last moment. The judge sentenced Joseph Quinton Mills to 4 consecutive life terms in Florida State Prison, no possibility of parole. He was taken away. He is currently housed at the Reception and Medical Center in Union County, Florida. He will grow old there. He will die there. He will never walk out. Jeff and Tim left that courtroom with something they hadn't had for 41 years, a locked door. Not peace, not full closure. Mills had taken that too by never explaining why. But the door was locked. The brothers still live miles apart. They still restore cars together. They visit their mother's grave every year on the anniversary and burn a candle beside her portrait. They kept going, the way Linda had always told them to. And that 12-year-old boy who couldn't close his eyes, he's a man now. And that image, the one from the hallway, the one Tim said he still sees, will never fully leave. Some things don't. But the monster has a face now, a name, a locked cell. And the case that was supposed to die unsolved is closed. CeCe Moore said it best when it was all over. At the time this crime was committed, they didn't even know DNA was going to be used in criminal investigations. The fact that they collected that evidence and stored it responsibly and carefully all those years, if that hadn't happened, we couldn't have done our work. The original investigators in 1981 preserved something they didn't fully understand yet. And 38 years later, that preserved evidence reached across time and pulled a killer out of his ordinary life. Linda Slaten was 31 years old. She made her own clothes to save money. She raised 2 boys alone. She survived an abusive marriage, rebuilt her life from nothing, moved to a new city for a fresh start, and said goodnight to her sons before walking into her bedroom. She never walked back out. The least she deserved was for someone to remember why. Joseph Mills got to live 40 years of freedom, a full life, a family, grandchildren, before facing any consequences. What does justice actually mean when the punishment comes 4 decades too late? Tim carried the killer's photo on his wall for 30 years without knowing. How does a betrayal that deep, from someone you trusted, ever fully heal? And if DNA privacy laws keep tightening, and databases like GED Match keep restricting access, how many cold cases like Linda's will never get solved? How many families will spend the rest of their lives waiting for an answer that never comes?